only mode.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining Workplace Options Professional Development Institute seminar. My name is Vanishri and I'll be your facilitator today. Our topic is counseling clients on the autism spectrum, and we are very pleased to have this session presented by Marcia Eckerd and Eric Endlich, who are part of our affiliate network. Dr. Marcia Eckerd, Ph.D. is a clinical psychologist working with people of all ages on the spectrum for 30 years. She serves on the CT-AST Advisory Council and on the Clinical Advisory Board of the Asperger and Autism Network. She has authored professional peer-reviewed journal articles on diagnosed ASD in adults and women, writes on neurodivergent thinkers of Psych Central, um, Autism Spectrum News, and Autism Parenting Magazine, and is a frequent speaker on neurodiversity. Dr. Eric Endlich, clinical psychologist and founder of Top College Consultant, helps students on the spectrum transition to college and graduate school. He serves on the clinical advisory board of the Asperger and Autism Network and the LD and ND committee of the Independent Education Consultants Association, and is the co-author of an international study of 150 autistic adults. I'm very happy to be working with Marcia and Eric today, and I believe you all will come away from this webinar with a lot of valuable information. We will be getting started shortly. I would first like to make a couple of notes for you all. You're all welcome to comment and chat with us utilizing the questions box, which is in the control panel. The slides presented today will be emailed to you in PDF form following the session and will be accompanied by the link to the seminar recording as well as your professional development certificate. Please keep a lookout for these items in your inbox. You should receive them within 48 hours following today's presentation. Without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Marcia and Eric, and thank you all again for being here today. Over to you, Marcia and Eric.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Eric Endlich, and I'm going to skip through the slides on our bios since we've already heard about us. Again, I work with neurodivergent students worldwide, helping them transition to college and grad school. Marcia, did you want to say anything, or should we?
No, let's move on.
Okay, so we're talking today about a new way to think about autism, the neurodiversity paradigm. Before I jump into that, let me just say I'm going to be primarily using identity first language, that is referring to autistic people, not people with autism. Sometimes in their training, people are taught, clinicians are taught that they should use person first language, person with autism, but in fact, surveys of autistic people show that over 80% prefer identity first language, an autistic person. So the neurodiversity paradigm is the notion that autism is simply a different kind of brain. Just like we all have bodies of different shapes and sizes, we have brains that differ. And one of the differences is the autistic pattern. You may be familiar with other neurodivergent variations, such as ADHD, learning disabilities, dyslexia, twice exceptional, meaning gifted, plus having another neurodivergence such as dyslexia or ADHD, intellectual disabilities, and so on. So it's simply being different rather than looking at it from a pathological way. The medical model views autism as being a problem located in the person, that the person has a disorder or a disability that needs to be treated, corrected, normalized. This is an ableist view. This is looking at it from just as if you were looking at someone with a physical disability and you're an able-bodied person, looking at them as defective or deficient. Whereas the social model looks at it more of an issue of fit. In other words, say you have a person who gets around by wheelchair. If they come up to a building that has stairs and no elevator, you might see them as disabled and unable to get up the building. Whereas if you put an elevator in the building, suddenly they are able to get up and down the building. So it's more of an issue between the person and the environment rather than an inherent disability in the person.
I'm thinking about, we'd like to share with you thinking about the medical model. And we have a picture of DSM-5 here, which is American, but ICD-10 and ICD-11 have very similar criteria for being diagnosed as autistic. And I'd like to, just emphasize the point Eric made, which is that it's a very pathology-driven view. So it's not different kind of social interactions. It's a lack of reciprocal social interactions. There's a lot of evidence that shows that autistic people interact perfectly fine with other autistic people, just as people who are neurotypical, which is what we use for not autistic, although they're not a single group, interact fine with other neurotypical people. So this idea that it's a lack of interaction is, I think, part of the pathologizing of the medical model. There are deficits in reading nonverbal communication, and that's often a major stumbling block because research has shown that more than 50% of communication is nonverbal, by tone of voice, by expression of face. And relationship difficulties, I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but having relationships between neurotypical and neurodivergent people can be challenging because of these communication difficulties. So that can make it difficult to maintain relationships. A stereotype movement in speech is also something that's seen as, that and rigid rituals are seen as, quote, non-functional, which doesn't, if you have ADHD and you're wiggling your foot right now, it has a function for you. It's not a non-functional motor activity. So again, this presumption of lack of function is pathologizing. Intense areas of interest is something that is very typical, and it's unclear why that would be pathological. One would think that most inventors have, and actually there is literature that suggests that many inventors are in fact on the spectrum because they have intense areas of interest and many of the autistic traits that Eric will be describing. And people do have, many people, or most people, I think 80%, have some kind of sensory hypersensitivity, which again can be very difficult in an environment that does not fit. The neurodiversity model, on the other hand, thinks of it not so much as, it's not, the medical model is something more like measles. You either have it or you don't have it. And, you have a mild case of measles, a bad case of measles, but it's measles. In the neurodiversity model, you think in terms of an entire kind of spectrum of challenges, and you need to in some way have these challenges in order to have an autistic diagnosis. But different people have challenges to different degrees, so people look quite different from each other. And so the communication and relating issues are similar and recognized certainly in the autistic community, sensory issues, but we talk more about autistic traits, such as being very detail-oriented and being somewhat literal, so things that are not stated clearly can be misunderstood. People having very high standards for themselves and also perhaps of others, and being very, very truthful, so that there can be taking people at their word, or people not perceiving that other people aren't being truthful, or people are being manipulative, or people being teasing. And people tend, again, with this detail focus, to think in depth and to process in depth, so that if you ask someone a question, they might take a while to respond because they're really thinking about it at a deep level of all the different things that might mean or might imply, and not simply taking it superficially and answering back. But the bottom takeaway we'd like to have is there's a tendency to think that all autistic people look alike. And by the way, when we think of looking alike, we think of a male phenotype model, which is everybody looks like a particular kind of character, the kind of nerdy, flat, with male who's interested in some obscure thing. And in fact, many autistics don't look like that. And in particular, female autistics don't look like that, because many women learn to look as if they're fitting in socially at a quite young age. And so there are many undiagnosed, both men and particularly women, who may come into your office who are not diagnosed as autistic, but you might be listening for these kinds of traits.
Yeah, I just want to say also there are many undiagnosed older people on the spectrum. In the study that my colleagues and I did of 150 autistic adults, virtually everyone was diagnosed after age 40. And the problem is we didn't really know much about autism when we were growing up, so many of us who are autistic got overlooked. Go ahead, Marcia.
The most recent data about the prevalence of autism in America, and there tends to be a similar prevalence of most different issues worldwide, is 1 in 44. So if you have 100 people working for your company, you probably have at least 2 people who are on the spectrum. But there are a couple myths about autism that's just important as you're going in to see a client for you to know. First of all, there's an idea called theory of mind that autistic people don't know other people have a different perspective. And that's patently absurd, because from a very young age, autistic children are being told that they're doing everything wrong. So they very quickly get the idea that other people have a very different idea of what they should be doing, how they should be doing it. Autistic people may have a perspective that they see as, they've thought this through at a very deep level and they're pretty sure they're right, or they may miss the perspective of someone else, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity to know other people think differently and have minds. It's amazing how prevalent that is in the literature, even to this day. There's a thought that autistic people lack empathy. And research has shown that while autistic people may miss the perspective of someone else, particularly if they're just saying something in a non-emotional looking way, but actually autistic people in this research had more empathy with deep emotional distress than neurotypical people did. And to the degree where sometimes they actually became overwhelmed or had to leave because they had so much distress experiencing the distress of someone else. There's the idea that autistic
Can
people...
I just jump in with one thing there, Marcia? I think one reason why that gets misunderstood is not that the empathy isn't there, but that autistic people in that situation may not know how to express it, or may be overwhelmed by feelings, as Marcia was saying, so that they aren't able to, access their reaction or know what the person wants at that situation.
Or they may express empathy differently, so that the expectation is that someone's going to say, oh, I'm sorry, and they're going to have a particular look on their face, and they're going to, the body language will be something that's the primary conveyor of meaning, whereas an autistic person may not convey that body language and may for example, say, I had a similar experience, as a way of saying, I understand what you're going through, but instead that's perceived as they're focusing on themselves and not on you. So they may express it differently, but that doesn't mean there isn't the empathy there. The idea that autistic people prefer to be alone, so if you have someone in a work setting who is left out by the coworkers or who is isolated, that, well, that's okay because they want that. In fact, one theme that I hear among many autistic adults I work with is of loneliness, that there's a desire to be accepted, there's a desire to be connected, but this gulf between people where this communication gap is very difficult to bridge. Autistic people don't get unstated things. There's so much communication that is indirect and what I would, for lack of a better word, superficial. How are you? It's a good day. And it's like, that's not saying much of anything. And usually if someone says, how are you? They don't really want an answer. And so that can be confusing if you're autistic and you're thinking people mean what they say. And the last thing I'd like to emphasize is that the perception can be that autistic people are overreacting just because they're autistic. And as Eric said, we're talking about lack of fit here, so that if an autistic person becomes overwhelmed, it's generally because there's a good reason based on their experience, that either they're experiencing some kind of social rejection or social, ostracism, or maybe they have sensory problems and the environment is overwhelming, or there's too many people making too many demands simultaneously. But they're reacting because, just like anyone else, they're reacting because they're reacting to something that's not working. And so often there's this circular logic of, well, the person's just being that way because they're autistic, and that's not true. They're responding to something that's distressing the same way anyone else would.
Thanks. So, to use the analogy again of a physical disability, if you put someone with a physical disability into a workplace that was not accessible for them, of course they're going to have challenges. And similarly, if you put autistic people into a workplace that is not inclusive, that doesn't understand them, that's where they're surrounded by neurotypical people who don't accommodate or get them, they're going to have a variety of challenges. The social challenges include perspective taking. Doesn't mean that they don't understand that there's other perspectives, but they may not know what those perspectives are. And so they may miss social cues, they may miss unspoken rules, they may miss tone in conversation. If someone says things but they're being sarcastic or implied, they may miss that. May be very focused on being truthful, sometimes to the point of being blunt. So an autistic person may say something meaning to be honest that comes across as being rude because it's simply truthful, and they don't understand the social norm or are not comfortable with the social norm of being more discreet or diplomatic. And sometimes it isn't a matter of not understanding the norm, it's just not agreeing with it or not liking it. Similarly, dislike of small talk, which is a common social norm that you should come in, you should start a conversation with a very superficial conversation. Lots of people on the spectrum are not comfortable with that, don't like it, don't know how to do it. And so, as you can imagine, sometimes all this adds up to just being anxious about social interactions, knowing that people, that the gears grind, that there's this sort of friction because there are constant social breakdowns in communication. So you become anxious, you tend to avoid people, which, as Marcia said, can be interpreted as wanting to be alone. It's just wanting to avoid these kinds of challenges and interactions. And also becoming exhausted from interacting because it's so hard to be always kind of on thinking about, am I coming across okay? What do people think? Did I offend someone? Other kinds of challenges in the workplace can include need for routine. One thing that sort of amuses me to see a common movie trope where the notion that a character wakes up in a movie and it has to relive the same day over and over again. One example is Groundhog Day, but there's other movies with that notion. And that's perceived, or that's portrayed as a nightmare in the movies. But to an autistic person, to me, that's like great. That's like a dream day would be, where everything is predictable and very similar. So there's a preference for routine. Sometimes the black and white thinking can come across as inflexibility, thinking of things as sort of in very extreme terms and literal terms. Because of the social challenges we talked about, sometimes language processing can be slow. So if you have a conversation with someone and want their reaction, it's not, if they're not saying anything, it doesn't mean they weren't listening. It may mean that they need time to think about what you said and get back to you. And maybe that needs to be worked out so that you have this understanding that they don't have to respond on the spot. We talked about the anxiety because of the inflexibility, intense focus, black and white thinking. Sometimes that can come across as perseverating and saying the same thing over and over again because they're anxious, because they feel like it's not being heard or addressed. And then
I'd like to jump in on just one quick thing. As we said at the beginning, there's a tendency to pathologize. And so the idea of inflexibility is, you know, okay, that's bad, that's rigidity. But in fact, a person can be inflexible in insisting on having high standards consistently and not wanting to go along if people are wanting to cut corners and not do something well. There was a fascinating research study where they took autistics and they took neurotypicals. They gave them a task where if you did it in a way that was morally compromised, you won. If you did it in a way that was morally correct, you lost. And the majority of neurotypicals did it in a way that was morally compromised when they were doing it in private, but some of them switched when they were in public. The the autistic people did it in a way that was morally correct all the time. And the conclusion of the researchers wasn't that, isn't it great that autistic people have a lot of integrity? It was that autistic people are inflexible. So this, you know, when you take this inflexibility as something that's not necessarily pathological, it may be that the person has standards that they don't simply compromise at their convenience.
Yeah, and I would argue that there are lots of figures in history, whether it's inventors, as you mentioned, or saints or what have you, that have been extremely focused and inflexible in their pursuit of a goal that we actually admire, or perhaps you know, successful entrepreneurs who've been very driven. Sometimes that's really admired and not really seen as being inflexible, but people have to be inflexible sometimes to pursue a single-minded goal. And then finally, there's the sensory challenges, which definitely can come up in the workplace, where typically people on the spectrum have hypersensitivity in one or more sensory modalities, sometimes hyposensitivity, like lower, higher threshold for pain, not noticing things, but more commonly, with the issue is the hypersensitivity, auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory. So being very sensitive to sounds, being in a crowd where there's a lot of people talking, having difficulty focusing, not liking the overhead lights, the fluorescent lights, because they perceive them as flashing, not wanting to be touched, or being in a close environment, or being very, very sensitive to smells, and noticing sounds that other people in the workplace may be very easily able to tune out. You know, from birth, humans are able to accommodate or become desensitized to sounds, so that we, or smells, so that we don't really notice background things. But if you're on the spectrum, those things may continue to be very bothersome.
And it's important to think about the environment from that perspective, understanding that whatever the sensory issue is exaggerated from a neurotypical perspective, but from the autistic perspective, it may actually be painful or intolerable. So in a work situation where, say, there's multiple people in the room having conversations, there's something going on outside, maybe there's an elevator opening and closing, that might be an intolerable level of noise going on, and it causes stress. And as you all know, stress creates a fight-flight response, it's cortisol in the body, and it makes it difficult to think. I mean, none of us can think well when we're stressed, and our body is having an autonomic limbic reaction. So if you think of this as creating a stress response, it's going to have an impact on performance. I'd like to say a little about understanding autistic clients, because the client may come in, and as Eric said, the question of who's autistic is a really important question, because many autistic adults, especially if they're in a workplace, might not be recognized as autistic. So what we're asking you to do is to take all of these qualities and descriptors we're giving you and have that in the back of your mind when you're seeing someone, because someone may come in identified as depressed, or identified as anxious, identified as having one of the many co-occurring conditions like ADHD or having an eating disorder, and in fact also be autistic.
Or OCD.
Or OCD. There's a very common phrase that's used called high functioning autism. And quickly, my takes on that are high functioning autism has no real definition. My idea of what the definition is, gee, you don't look autistic. But it's a very misleading term, because people who are, regardless of what they look like, if people who look like they're doing fine, have all the same struggles going on inside them, be it social or sensory or the way they're processing information. And so the idea that somebody is high functioning, meaning they don't need support or they don't need, they don't have real issues needing help, is misleading and leaves many people unsupported. Masking is something that Eric mentioned before, and I'd like to just give you a quick idea about it. When you think of masking, many people, when they teach social skills to children, think about teaching them what to say. Say, hi, my name is such and such. Here's a way of talking about the weather. Ask 3 questions on topic. But masking is much more complex. And I actually was interviewing someone yesterday and got this quote, which I wanted to share with you, describing what masking is, which is, I usually try to guess what the other person would need me to do in order to believe the things I say, and then try to do those things in a way that isn't too unnatural. So someone who's autistic is trying to figure out, what exactly is this person saying, and what are they meaning, what do they want back from me? If they're not using nonverbal cues themselves, how do I arrange my face? How do I sit? What tone of voice should I have? How do I frame this in a way so that the person perceives it as meaning what I mean and not insulting or rude or, or off topic? And so this business of masking is exhausting. And imagine if you're doing this with more than one person at a time, trying to figure everyone out, and you're thinking less about yourself and what do I want to say than how do I meet the other person where they're at? How do I match the other person? So that's one reason why even people who are quite successful that I've met, who are the heads of corporations, might go home and just collapse and be exhausted at the end of the day from this effort. And last, again, we're just reiterating, everyone is different. So the autistic people have a saying, if you've seen one autistic person, you've seen one autistic person. The next person is probably going to look different. So one of the other points I want to make is who defines the problem. Sometimes a supervisor may suggest someone on the spectrum come into you for therapy or for evaluation because that person is not getting along in the workplace or is perceived as problematic. But it's important that you understand that if you have someone who is in with you, that person has to define the problem from their perspective. So the supervisor may see this person as disruptive. The autistic client may see this as it's incredibly stressful and incredibly anxiety producing to be in this environment. And the autistic person, as with any client, the person you're seeing defines the goal. So the goal might be to make this less stressful and less anxiety arousing. That may get to what it is in the environment or what it is in the task or what it is in the social demand that makes it so difficult to be there, which gets to why the supervisor is perceiving that things aren't working well. But it's really important to take it from the perspective of the person who is your client and not the idea that, well, this person wants this person fixed so that there's no problem. So in terms of what you treat, we did have a question, and autism is a neurotype. Autism is a way of processing and thinking. So you don't treat autism any more than you would treat someone for being Black, or you would treat someone for their sexual identity. And you, what you treat is what the person comes in with as a description of their perception of the goal, and it might be anxiety or depression. And one of the things that's important to look at if you have someone who's depressed, for example, is is the depression primary as they have a family that has depressive disorders, and there's and the person has all the classic symptoms of a depressive disorder, or is it depression secondary to the fact that they're getting negative feedback, they're isolated, and their system, their environment isn't working for them? So you always have to have this primary, secondary question in your head, and be aware of the co-occurring disorders like ADHD, sleep disorder, OCD, eating disorders, because people often are autistics are overrepresented in these populations, and people are often coming in with one of these other issues and in fact have autism, are autistic as well.
Yeah, and the gender diversity, although it's not a disorder, is there's high percentage of people who are gender non-conforming or autistic, and high percentage of people who are autistic have are not necessarily straight or presenting as cisgender.
So how do you work with an autistic client? Well, the first thing that's important is, because people are not necessarily using nonverbal communication in the same way as a neurotypical, you might find them difficult to read. They might not be facially expressive, or sometimes they may, for example, have expression that doesn't seem to match what they're saying. Many have alexithymia and have described to me actually working with a therapist to help them identify feelings that they may, for example, have a physical experience which they don't identify as anxiety or embarrassment or whatever it might be, and the therapist actually helps them figure out what it is they're feeling. So I had one patient where we basically went by his behavior. If he was avoiding something, then probably he was anxious, and then we worked backwards from there. The truthfulness, I just want to give you a very quick example. I had a young woman who came in to me. She was wondering about gender identity. She hadn't grown up thinking that she was something other than a girl, but she didn't like, as she was developing, female characteristics, and she was uncomfortable. So she wanted me to tell her sexual identity. So I spent about 20 minutes talking about the development of sexual identity. She looked at me and she said, well, that certainly wasn't useful. Now, what she had wanted was a yes or no, this is what it is answer. I couldn't give it to her, but she was not being rude. She was simply being honest. I wanted this sorted out. I don't want to have to live for years figuring this out. And so you're going to have a patient who might be overly blunt in telling you whether something's useful, and that's not an insult to you. And I get it, be aware, don't take this personally. Someone may be slow processing, as Eric has said before, in terms of really taking in what you say at a deep level. And again, may have sensory issues. Think of your office environment. If you have a cup of coffee there, or if you had lunch and lunch is very pungent in its smell, or if you have bright lights in your office, or some other sensory issue, that might be overwhelming to your autistic client.
Yeah, for example, if you have a sound machine or a fan or air conditioner on, somebody might walk in and say, what's that noise? I can't, it's very distracting. So these sounds, smells, sights can be very distracting.
Yeah, even something like cologne or aftershave can be extremely distracting.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult for because autistic people are so detail-oriented, open-ended. They have many, many things in their minds, and to be asked an open-ended question can be very confusing. So it's, instead of how are things going, which is not really anything clear, asking a question like, was there anything of concern going on in the office this week, is something that helps structure what the person is thinking about. And the thing that is most important, if you've ever heard of the work of Ross Greene and Lives in the Balance, I really suggest you check it out if you haven't. But the idea is you really want to ask enough questions to be sure you understand the perspective of the person you're talking with. if the perspective of the person is misinterpreting nonverbal cues, for example, and thinking that people are being negative, you don't want to just say, well, they're not being positive. You want to listen and say, I understand it. I get it. You feel that people are being negative, and then explore that with them rather than invalidate them. Because so often people who are on the spectrum are invalidated constantly. You're doing something rude, you're doing something wrong, as opposed to understanding their experience. Yes, I really understand. It's important to you that this be done in this way, and I respect that. At the same time, you're in a work group that is perhaps under a deadline where they are letting go of those standards. Social processing can be like what I described briefly before, which is helping understand what a social situation is. For example, an autistic person might not pick up on office politics, that there's a particular person who is the one in charge that you run everything by, and going about it in a different way is not perceived as okay. And so sometimes what you're doing is processing a situation to help the autistic client understand it, or reframing it so that the autistic person can see a different perspective in terms of how the others are operating. And self-regulation, if you're in an environment that is sensorily intolerable, or if you're in an environment with social demands that are just, confusing, or directions that are unclear, if you're literal minded and you need things to be clear, then a person can get upset, and helping the person come up with strategies such as taking a break or finding something that they can do that allows them to self-calm is really important, because for all of us, if we're having an emotional response, that basically can impact the thinking part of our brains and the part of us that can use self-talk or use self-regulatory strategies. So it's important that the person has strategies if they do become overwhelmed, for being able to calm down, and then use strategies that perhaps you help them come up with. So the basic issue here is the idea that empathy goes two ways. There's often a criticism that people who are autistic people don't understand the perspective of the non-autistic person. Well, the non-autistic person probably isn't much better at understanding the perspective of the autistic person. And so the non-autistic person, the neurotypical person, might say something like, well, this job is a mess, and intend for the autistic person to know that they want them to do something. The autistic person doesn't get that. Well, that's not just the autistic person not understanding, it's the neurotypical person not being clear. And so it's important to create realistic expectations for both people for the non-autistic person, the need for clarity, for example, and for the autistic person, understanding what the neurotypical person might be meaning, or what the expectation, so that finding a way of being able to navigate that environment. So what you're going to be doing is defining strategies together that help the person navigate whatever it is that needs to be done. In addition, and Eric will get to, defining accommodations that might be necessary for that person. And it's important to remember that if someone is processing more slowly, if you are speaking quickly, if things are moving quickly, that might be useful to have written or visual feedback that the person can access, as well as oral feedback. And so that's something that you might consider in terms of both of you taking notes on strategies in the session.
Yeah, so I'm going to just try to fly through the rest of the slides as best I can. There'll be plenty of time for questions. We understand it's an international audience. You're not all located in the U.S. So I'm just using the ADA as an example. In the U.S., there's a federal law where if an employee is otherwise able to do their job with reasonable accommodations on the part of the employer, that it would be illegal to discriminate against them, to not hire them, to fire them, and so on. And autism is recognized as a disability. So we're going to talk about, different ways to accommodate autism in the workplace so that people can be successful. But, it's important to know the laws in the country that you're operating in. And one type of accommodation would be to provide structure. What Marcia talked about, how unstructured questions and unstructured situations, ambiguity, uncertainty is anxiety provoking for anyone, but particularly for people who are on the spectrum who may really struggle to understand what's expected. If there's going to be any sort of change of any kind in the workplace, try to give advance notice. Don't spring things on people. Again, a lot of these accommodations are things that would be helpful for neurotypical people too. In many cases, accommodations are not just helpful for the group that are being targeted or addressed, but they can be helpful for all employees. So giving people as much notice as possible of changes so there's no surprises, as changes anxiety provoking, making directions clear and specific, be as explicit as possible, define things concretely. Don't give vague feedback or general goals or vague goals and directions.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and just say that there are some studies that show that autistic employees can be 80% more productive because they are very hyper-focused, they have high standards, they're not taking time off to talk to people, and because they are very clear and working very specifically on what the task is, that work groups that are a combination of neurotypical and neurodiverse people can be as much as 50% more effective, because the autistic person is insisting that we know exactly what we're doing, whereas neurotypical people often can have a vague direction, keep going, but not be producing the product quite so efficiently.
Yeah, and again, these are accommodations that probably would be helpful for any employee. To be specific, don't tell someone, oh, you need to get along better with employees, you need to be a better team player. That's much too vague. It needs to be very specific and very explicit. Sensory accommodations, I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen Shore. He's a professor at Delphi University, one of the most famous autistic people. You see pictures of him, you see him present. He's almost always wearing a baseball cap with a visor, and he's very clear in his presentations. This is not a fashion statement. This is an accommodation to help block light from distracting him. So let people let you know what kind of accommodation would be helpful. Of course, you have to ask the employee. In the workplace, if they're distracted by noises, allowing them to wear headphones, allowing them to avoid noisy places like a lunchroom, making meetings optional if that is overwhelming for them, trying to make things as optional as possible when it's appropriate, of course. Being sensitive to this, somebody might not want to hug, they might not want to shake hands, they might find physical contact uncomfortable. Certainly they might be bothered by smells, and they might need sensory breaks and be allowed to move and fidget to be more comfortable. Socially, I've talked about allowing breaks from social interaction. If there's a party, an event, a meeting, letting people leave and take a break. Being very clear and explicit about any kind of boundaries, including unwanted behavior. There might be situations where someone acts inappropriately because they don't understand the expectations. So you can't just tell someone that that's not okay. You have to be very explicit about what is and isn't okay. Clarify the social rules. Be realistic. The person's on the spectrum, they're different, they're not neurotypical. And as Marcia said, educating the rest of the employees too, so that they can be more flexible and accommodating, just as you would if a person had visual or auditory impairment. You'd want to educate people so that they're more sensitive to their needs. And don't assume
I think
that
the feedback, I think the
ahead.
feedback about boundaries and behavior is important in this area, in this era of heightened sensitivity about harassment, because a person on the spectrum there was an article in the New York Times about how a person on the spectrum said, "I like you," to someone else in the office, and how the person was looking at that person, and that was perceived as harassment. That you might think you like someone, but you're not supposed to say it. Or the person didn't perceive that this person wasn't, because the person smiled, that this person wasn't going to be welcoming that. and being able to say, you know, it's okay to like someone, but you know, you don't say that, or you don't stand too close to someone. These kinds of things are not intended to be harassing, but it can be attributed as intended otherwise. So it's important to be very clear about what boundaries there are and what behavior might not be perceived as acceptable.
And again, that that's something that would be helpful for any employee. So these are not just specific to autistic employees. So as Marcia alluded to earlier, these differences, the differences of being autistic, can be an advantage or a benefit if you see it that way. And in fact, many companies, many large companies have now been proactively recruiting employees on the spectrum because they see the advantages that these employees bring. And there's a whole neurodiversity at work, there's a whole autism at work movement, there's organizations, there's companies that have whole programs to bring in employees on the spectrum because of their attention to detail and hyper-focus for certain tasks, like software testing, for example, as an example where autistic employees have much lower error rates and are great at finding details and catching things that other employees, that neurotypical employees might not have. Being very compliant with rules, being very loyal. You know, autistic people can often have difficulty getting or keeping a job. So if they're given a job and treated well, they tend to be very loyal and not want to leave and have low turnover rates. They don't like change. They like routine. So they're going to stay in their job as long as they're treated well. And often, you know, creative, honest, accurate, many of them quite bright, very logical. These can all be huge assets in the right environment.
This is just a list of people who are autistic. Dan Aykroyd these are all people who are they've shared their autistic diagnoses. There are many people like Bill Gates who are thought to be, Einstein, who are thought to be autistic, but haven't necessarily been diagnosed publicly. But someone like Dan Aykroyd as a kid was very interested in the supernatural. He was very interested in police work, and he used his area of interest to write Ghostbusters. You know, Musk created Tesla, and again, this was an area of interest. And if you don't know who Satoshi Tajiri is, he created Pokemon, and it certainly helps to be very detail-oriented and very, very focused to come up with a world that's quite so complex. So our takeaways are these, that autistic clients can look very different, but inside they can have very similar struggles, and you'll only find that out by asking and listening. You need to address what's concerning the client, and the only way to establish a relationship of trust is to be direct and clear and honest in what you say, so that the person knows that they can be open and direct with you as well. The accommodations can be simple and they can be free and can benefit everyone. And that your role is vital, because often an autistic person will have experienced difficulties with most other people because of the struggles to get across that communication gap we've described. You can be that person who is direct. You can be that person who gets it and helps others get it. And I can't tell you how important that is, because you might be the first one that they've run across who's willing to take that trouble.
And we've just listed a few. Go ahead, Marcia.
No, you do this one.
I was just going to say, we've just listed a few resources here that might be helpful. There's lots of other books and organizations. You're welcome to reach out to us if you want suggestions of other ones. We didn't put the ASAN as a reference, but there's lots of other organizations. We've just had good experience ourselves with AANE. There are books on working with employees on the spectrum. I think Marcia already mentioned Ross Green's book, and there's our contact information if you have questions for us or want to reach out to us. Thank you so much. We would love to hear your questions. Can you? Yeah, I don't.
So we have received few questions in here.
Yeah.
So I can just read it out for you.
Okay. Yeah, because I can't really see them.
Yeah, you can't see
Okay.
them.
Right. Oh, fine. Okay. What are the brain differences that would indicate a neurotypical as distinct from a person who is on the autistic spectrum? Would you want me to read out again?
The brain differences?
Yes.
Do you want to answer
What
that,
are the
Marcia?
brain differences? Yeah.
Well, I think that at this point, there's research, but it's not there. There's no clear answers to that in terms of if you're talking about using functional MRI or you're talking about actually doing neuropsychological research. I think as someone who is dealing with a client one-on-one, what's important is to listen for the kind of traits we're discussing. If someone is struggling socially in their environment, if someone is stressed out and anxious because it's just too loud there and they can't think and they can't work, if the person is quite literal, or if the person is really taking things in depth, whereas most people are comfortable with a very superficial take on things, then you need to think about autism. And research, meanwhile, is going on to see if there is some differentiation. But actually, that's not something that is done, and or it's certainly not done as part of an evaluation at this point.
Right. So let's go to the next one. So generally, does increasing awareness or education of those social challenges to an autistic person help them, or does it potentially create more stress for them?
Well, I'll start with that. If as Eric said, if your feedback is be a team player, or if your feedback is well, you need to be more thoughtful. What on earth do those things mean? If what you want to say is, okay, how can you can help the person self-advocate, and it can be difficult and uncomfortable to ask for clarification or ask for directions. You may feel that in some ways it means you're not as good an employee. The person needs to be encouraged, for example, to ask for clarification if they're not sure what someone else is intending them to do. Or, for example, sometimes, as I mentioned, social processing, helping someone understand, what are the unspoken rules of the workplace. It may not be evident in job descriptions, but who is it you're supposed to approach if you have a particular kind of concern? So if you're going to say, well, you have to start picking up on social cues, that's not going to be terribly helpful, because that's the area where this person is challenged. So you have to think about helping a person socially navigate the environment, as well as helping other people understand that this is a person who may go directly to the point and not spend a whole lot of time talking about the weather or what you did on the weekend. And that doesn't mean the person isn't caring. It means, the person's style is to be very task-oriented.
I would add that if you're autistic, you've probably known your whole life that there was some sort of mismatch. In our study of 150 older autistic adults, over 80% had been bullied as children. So most autistic kids are having some experience early on in life that, it's not working, there's something wrong. And so that isn't really news. But if you figure out later in life that you're autistic, as I did, the most common reaction we found was relief. It tends to be very helpful to help you make sense of the world, and then kind of move forward and try to understand, okay, so where are the difficulties and what can I do about them? Other questions?
Yes. Yeah, sure. Thanks for answering that.
Mm-hmm.
So the next is, I hear you differentiating autism from ADHD, dypraxia, dyslexia, etc. Is it possible that some of these conditions are different expressions of autism or indications of different form of autism?
Well, going for diagnosis, I think what is most useful, as with anyone, yes, issues with attention, particularly in areas that aren't interesting, can be something that is challenging for autistic adults. But the question about ADHD is, are there enough ADHD symptoms in terms of all the things you know, to create a coexisting problem that needs to be treated? So that, well, yes, there can be obsessional traits, or there can be attention issues in someone who is autistic as part of their autism. You really need to look at, is this something that is also coexisting? For example, people with autism often are quite anxious if you're having all of the experiences that we've been describing, but there might also have a coexisting anxiety disorder, and taking a family history and looking at their symptoms, because people can be treated, whether with medication or other ways, if they have a coexisting problem that's not simply due to their experience in the workplace.
It's a good question. Diagnoses are a constantly evolving process. Certainly there's a lot of overlap, that a lot of people on the spectrum also have ADHD, and there's overlap in the symptoms. So are we at some point in the future going to have a different view of what comes under the umbrella of autism? Perhaps, but it is what it is right now.
Okay, thank you. So the next is, as regards blunt or truthfulness, I have a client with autism who can be rude and tell a helper that what they are doing. In this case, a brain spotting that this focus on his eyes was absolutely not just not working, but highly aversive. Any suggestions?
Eric, do you want to go with that?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Was it that telling him to make eye contact was aversive? Was that the main point?
Yeah, that is all it has been said in that question.
Yeah.
Would you want to reframe that, Henry?
Well, for many people on the spectrum, they will describe it, they can't make eye contact and listen at the same time. And this may be a situation where the expectation of the person on the spectrum is not a good one for that person. If you want me to hold still when I need to be moving, or you want me to make eye contact, I'm going to focus all my energy on doing that, but I might not be able to listen, take in what you're saying, and process it as well. So the question is, why is that such a big deal? I think it's an excellent question,
Yeah.
and it's often focused on, but why is that so important? And could there be an understanding that this person might do better if they're not making eye contact?
Sometimes people use little tricks, like you look at the person's nose and that, you know, it appears that you're looking at their eyes. But you know, it's better to accommodate the person rather than forcing them to do something that, as Marcia said, may make it hard for them to be able to process the conversation, and to try to understand what the challenge is.
Yeah, I would think that many of you out there might have ADHD, or might have something else. You might fidget while you're listening to this conference, or you might be doing something at the same time, like doodling or whatever. And if I told you you absolutely could not fidget, and you had to put all of your energy into not fidgeting, wouldn't that distract you from listening if fidgeting helps you listen? So I think you need to think about what is working for this autistic person, and how can you help them function at their best, rather than describe how they have to function.
When I was doing therapy full time, I had a client who would come into a job interview and disclose, hey, I'm autistic, and so if you notice that I'm not making eye contact or something else, please, you know, bear that in mind. And she had very good results when she disclosed that. So sometimes, you know, for the employee, disclosing that and saying, hey, eye contact is uncomfortable for me, please please be understanding, that can be helpful if the employee is comfortable with that. I know we're almost out of time.
Yeah, thanks for those examples as well. Yeah, let's hope that this is being use, like this is being helpful for them. So we have last 1 minute to go, so I'll take up one last question, and we have to hard stop on this. Okay.
Mhm.
So greetings from Galway, Ireland. My autistic client has been let go from many jobs. Should she disclose her autism? She is reluctant to do so.
Well, I kind of touched on that with my last comment. I think that it's partly a matter of finding the right company, finding the right employer. And again, many employers are increasingly being sophisticated and neuro-inclusive. And some applicants have found it helpful to disclose, even in the interview process. That's a very personal decision, but sometimes that helps kind of, or after you've been hired, which of course would be less risky because you've already got the job, to get more accommodations. You can't expect your employer to accommodate to something you haven't disclosed.
But that's a really good question, and I know we're just about out of time, so I'd like to encourage you to reach out to either of us. You have the contact information in these slides, and we'd be more than happy to explain other things or answer other questions, because these are all excellent questions you're asking.
Yeah, sorry we didn't have time for all of them.
Yeah, we are sorry we couldn't take up the rest of the questions, which are more important for you. Okay, so we are moving into the end part of the session. So thank you so much, Marcia and Eric. This was a wonderful presentation, and I'm sure we all learned a lot. So I thank you all for being here today and appreciate your attention. As I stated previously, the slides you have just seen will be emailed to you in PDF form following the session, and will be accompanied by the link to the seminar recording, as well as your professional development certificate. So this concludes today's Workplace Options Professional Development Institute seminar. Thank you all for your time, and have a wonderful week. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.